The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace, as hundreds of tourists gathered behind the metal barriers. Among them stood Maria, a 67-year-old grandmother from a small village in Spain. She had saved for 3 years to make this trip to London, her first time ever leaving her home country. Maria clutched her old camera with trembling hands. Not from nervousness, but from the early stages of Parkinson's disease that she had been hiding from. Her family? She didn't want them to worry or try to stop her from fulfilling her lifelong dream of seeing the famous royal guards. The crowd buzzed with excitement as the changing of the guard ceremony was about to begin. Children pressed their faces against the barriers while parents held up phones and cameras. Tour guides spoke in multiple languages, explaining the history and tradition they were about to witness. Maria had positioned herself at the very front, arriving 2 hours early to secure the best spot. She wore her finest dress, a navy blue one with small white flowers that her late husband had bought her 20 years ago. Around her neck hung a simple gold locket containing his photograph. As the guards marched into formation, their red uniforms brilliant in the morning light, Maria raised her camera, but her hands betrayed her. The device slipped from her grasp and clattered to the ground, the battery compartment breaking open and batteries scattering across the pavement. The tourists around her barely noticed, too focused on taking their own pictures. Maria knelt down slowly, her arthritic knees protesting, trying to gather the broken pieces of her camera. Her eyes filled with tears as she realized her dream of capturing this moment was slipping away. The ceremony continued around her as she struggled to pick up the small parts. Other tourists stepped around her, some tutting impatiently as she blocked their view. No one stopped to help the elderly woman who was clearly distressed. Maria finally managed to collect most of the pieces. But when she tried to stand, her legs wouldn't cooperate. The medication she took for her condition was wearing off, and her muscles were becoming stiff. She remained crouched on the cold stone, feeling invisible among the crowd of younger, more agile tourists. The guard closest to her position was Sergeant James Mitchell, a 28-year-old man who had served in the Queen's Guard for 6 years. He was known among his colleagues for his strict adherence to protocol and his unwavering discipline. Standing at attention in his iconic bearskin hat and red tunic, he was trained to remain completely motionless and expressionless no matter what happened around him, but something about the elderly woman's quiet struggle caught his attention from the corner of his eye. While he couldn't turn his head or break formation, he could see her distress. He watched as she tried unsuccessfully to stand, noticed how her hands shook as she held the broken camera pieces, and saw the tears she was trying to hide from the crowd around her. James had seen many situations during his time as a royal guard. Tourists often tried to make him laugh, speak, or break his stoic stance. Children would make faces at him. Adults would pose beside him for photos, and some would even try to touch his uniform or rifle. He'd been trained to ignore all of these distractions and maintain his position no matter what. The Queen's Guard had strict rules that were never to be broken. They could not speak to tourists, could not smile or show emotion, could not leave their post, and certainly could not interact with the public during a ceremony. These rules had been in place for centuries and were considered sacred traditions of the British monarchy, but as James stood there watching Maria struggle, something stirred inside him that was stronger than protocol. He thought of his own grandmother, back in Yorkshire, who had raised him after his parents died in a car accident when he was 12. She had the same gentle way about her, same dignity even when facing difficulties. The ceremony was reaching its climax, with guards marching in perfect synchronization while the band played traditional military music. The crowd was completely absorbed in the spectacle, cameras clicking and videos recording every moment. But James's attention remained divided between his duties and the elderly woman who was still crouched on the ground. Maria finally managed to get to her feet, using the metal barrier for support. Her face was flushed with embarrassment, and she kept looking around to see if anyone had noticed her struggle. The broken camera pieces were clutched in her weathered hands like precious fragments of a shattered dream. She looked up at the ceremony. She had traveled so far to see, but her view was now blocked by taller tourists who had moved in front of her while she was on the ground. At her height of barely 5 feet, she could only see the backs of other people's heads and their raised cameras. Maria tried to move to find a better viewing spot, but her condition made it difficult to navigate through the crowd. Every step was uncertain, and she was afraid of falling again. She stood at the very back now, straining to catch even a glimpse of the guards she had dreamed of seeing. James could see her disappointment, even from his position. The ceremony was nearly over, and this woman who had clearly made such an effort to be here was missing it all because of her unfortunate accident. He knew that in a few minutes, the guards would march away, and her chance would be gone forever. The internal conflict grew stronger within him. On one side was everything he had been taught about duty, tradition, and following orders without question. On the other side was a basic human instinct to help someone in need. He thought about what kind of person he wanted to be, not just as a guard, but as a human being. As the final notes of the ceremony's music began to play, James made a decision that would change both his life and Maria's in ways he could never have imagined. It was a choice that went against every rule in the book but felt more right than anything he had ever done in his military career. As the ceremony concluded and the other guards began their march back to the palace, James did something unprecedented. Instead of following his unit, he stepped out of formation and walked directly toward Maria. The crowd, which had been chattering and moving about, suddenly fell silent. Hundreds of tourists stopped mid-conversation. Cameras lowered, and children stopped running around. Even the tour guides paused their explanations. Everyone stared in disbelief as the tall guard in his magnificent red uniform approached the small elderly woman standing alone at the back of the crowd. Maria looked up in confusion and fear. She thought she had done something wrong, that perhaps she had violated some rule by dropping her camera during the ceremony. Her hands trembled more noticeably as the imposing figure approached her, his black boots clicking against the stone pavement with each measured step. James stopped directly in front of Maria and did something that made the entire crowd gasp audibly. He slowly and deliberately removed his tall bearskin hat, revealing his closely cropped brown hair and kind blue eyes. Then, in a gesture that went against everything he had been trained to do, he smiled warmly at her. "Ma'am," he said in a gentle voice that carried clearly in the sudden silence, "I noticed you had some trouble with your camera. I'm terribly sorry that happened during your visit." Maria's eyes widened with surprise. She had expected to be scolded or asked to leave, not spoken to with such kindness. Her limited English made it difficult for her to respond immediately, but she managed to whisper, I am sorry. I did not mean to cause problem." James could hear her Spanish accent and noticed how she struggled with the English words. He also observed the way her hands shook and how carefully she moved, recognizing signs he had seen in his own grandmother during her final years. "You haven't caused any problem at all," James assured her, his voice getting even gentler. "Would you like me to help you with something?" The crowd around them had grown completely still. Even the police officers and palace security staff seemed frozen, unsure of how to react to this unprecedented breach of protocol. Some tourists began recording with their phones, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Maria looked up at this tall, kind guard and felt overwhelmed by his unexpected compassion. In broken English, mixed with Spanish, she explained, "I come from Espaga, Spain. I saved money for 3 years to see guards. Very important for me. But my camera, ... She held up the broken pieces, her voice trailing off. James looked at the broken camera and then back at Maria's hopeful but sad expression. He could see this wasn't just about a broken camera or a missed photo opportunity. This was about a dream, about someone who had sacrificed and planned for years to have this one special moment. Without hesitation, James reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out his personal phone. "Ma'am, would you allow me to take some photos for you? I'd be honored to help you capture this memory." The crowd's silence deepened. This was unheard of. Royal guards didn't interact with tourists, let alone offer to take their pictures. Some people in the crowd began to murmur, wondering if this guard would get in serious trouble for breaking such important rules. Maria's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of joy and gratitude rather than sadness. She nodded eagerly, unable to speak for a moment because she was so moved by this unexpected kindness from a complete stranger. James carefully placed his bearskin hat on his head again and stood at attention beside Maria. "Would you like a photo with me in my uniform?" he asked. "I think that would make a lovely memory of your trip to London." Other tourists began gathering around, drawn by the unusual scene. Many of them started taking pictures of James and Maria together, realizing they were witnessing something special. Children pointed excitedly, and adults whispered to each other about the guard's remarkable act of kindness. James used his own phone to take several photos of Maria standing proudly beside him. Then he asked other tourists if they would take pictures of both of them together. A young couple from Germany immediately volunteered. Soon there was a small line of people offering to help capture the moment from different angles. But James wasn't finished. He could see that Maria was still struggling physically, and he noticed how tired she looked from standing for so long. "Ma'am, would you like to sit down for a moment? I can arrange for a chair," he offered. Before Maria could respond, James spoke to one of the palace staff members nearby. Within minutes, a chair was brought over for Maria to rest. The crowd watched in amazement as this royal guard, who was supposed to be stern and unapproachable, continued to show extraordinary care for this elderly tourist. As Maria sat and rested, James knelt down beside her chair so they could talk more easily. He asked her about her journey from Spain, about her family, and about what had brought her all the way to London. Despite the language barrier, they managed to communicate through a mixture of English, hand gestures, and the universal language of kindness. Maria told him about her late husband, who had always dreamed of visiting England. She explained that this trip was as much for his memory as it was for her own dream. She showed James the locket around her neck and, with tears in her eyes, told him how her husband had always talked about the famous royal guards and their dedication to duty. James listened intently, and when Maria finished her story, he stood up and did something that left everyone speechless once again. He removed his hat and bowed deeply to Maria, a gesture of respect usually reserved for members of the royal family. "Ma'am," he said, in a voice loud enough for the entire crowd too, "here, it would be my honor to present you with a proper royal guard experience. What happened next would be talked about for years to come." James began to perform a modified version of the changing of the guard ceremony. Just for Maria, he marched in formation, performed the traditional rifle movements, and demonstrated the precise steps that had been passed down through generations of guards. The crowd watched in complete silence, understanding they were witnessing something unprecedented and beautiful. Even the other palace staff and security officers stopped their duties to watch this remarkable display of human kindness. As James performed his impromptu ceremony for Maria, something magical happened in the courtyard. The crowd of strangers from different countries and cultures became united in witnessing this act of pure human kindness. People who had been pushing and competing for the best photo spots were now quietly making space for others to see and participate in this special moment. A family from Japan offered Maria some water from their bottle. A group of teenagers from America asked if they could help by taking more photos with their professional camera. An elderly British couple shared their folding chairs with other tourists who looked tired. The atmosphere had completely transformed from a typical tourist scramble into something resembling a community celebration. James completed his demonstration and returned to stand beside Maria's chair. He could see the joy and wonder in her eyes, and it reminded him why he had chosen to serve as a royal guard in the first place. It wasn't just about following rules or maintaining traditions. It was about representing something larger than himself, about embodying the values of service and honor that the uniform represented. "Ma'am," James said softly, "I have one more thing I'd like to do for you, if you'll permit me." Maria nodded, eagerly, still amazed that this wonderful experience was continuing. James reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pin from his uniform, one of the official Queen's Guard insignia that he was allowed to carry as a spare. "This pin represents the Queen's Guard," he explained, gently placing it in Maria's weathered hand. "I want you to have it as a memory of your visit, and as a token of respect for the journey you made to be here today." Maria stared at the small golden pin in her palm, overwhelmed by the significance of the gift. She tried to refuse, saying it was too precious, but James insisted with a warm smile. "Please take it," he said. "Every time you look at it, I want you to remember that your dream of seeing the royal guards came true, and that you touched the heart of at least one guard in return." By now, word of what was happening had spread throughout the area. Palace officials had arrived to assess the situation, and James knew that there would likely be consequences for breaking protocol so dramatically. But as he looked at Maria's tears of joy and heard the appreciative murmurs from the crowd, he felt no regret about his decision. A senior officer approached James, and the crowd held its breath, expecting the magical moment to be cut short. But instead of reprimanding James, the officer observed the scene for a moment and then made an announcement that surprised everyone. "Ladies and gentlemen," the officer said in a clear, authoritative voice, "what you have witnessed today represents the finest traditions of the Queen's Guard. While we maintain strict protocols during official ceremonies, the Guard has always stood for service, honor, and compassion." The crowd began to applaud, first softly and then with increasing enthusiasm. James felt a mixture of relief and pride, knowing that his actions had been understood and supported by his superiors. Maria slowly stood from her chair, steadied by James's gentle hand on her arm. She looked up at him with eyes full of gratitude and said in her careful English, "Thank you. You have given me more than photographs. You've given me faith in goodness of people." The story of James and Maria didn't end in that courtyard at Buckingham Palace. Several tourists had recorded the entire encounter, and within hours, got videos of the Royal Guard's extraordinary act of kindness were spreading across social media. Platforms around the world. News outlets picked up the story. And soon, James's simple act of human compassion became an international symbol of kindness, crossing cultural and language barriers. The video was viewed millions of times, with people from every continent sharing their own stories of unexpected kindness from strangers. Maria returned to her small village in Spain as a local celebrity. Her neighbors and family, who had worried about her traveling alone with her condition, were amazed and proud when they saw her story featured on television news programs. The photos James had taken for her became treasured possessions, displayed prominently in her modest home. But the impact went far beyond the immediate fame. Maria's story inspired other elderly people in her community to pursue their own dreams. Regardless of physical limitations or fears about traveling, a local travel group was formed specifically to help seniors fulfill their travel wishes. With Maria as an honorary advisor, James faced no disciplinary action for breaking protocol. Instead, his actions were reviewed by palace officials and military commanders, who concluded that he had demonstrated the very best qualities of a royal guard. His compassion and quick thinking had turned a potentially negative situation into a powerful demonstration of British values and hospitality. The Queen herself was reported to have been pleased with James's actions when she learned of the incident. His act of kindness reflected well on the monarchy and showed that the traditions of the Royal Guard were not just about rigid ceremony, but about service to all people. James continued his service as a royal guard, but with a new understanding of what his role truly meant. He realized that being a protector wasn't just about defending buildings or following orders, but about protecting the dignity and dreams of people like Maria. He began to look at his duty through the lens of service to humanity, not just service to protocol. The story continued to resonate months later, when James received a letter from Maria's family in Spain. She had passed away peacefully in her sleep just 6 months after her trip to London. Her family wrote that she had spent those final months sharing her story with everyone who would listen, always emphasizing the kindness of the guard who had made her dream come true. They included with the letter the Queen's Guard pin that James had given her. Maria had requested that it be returned to him with a message. "Tell the kind guard that he gave me the most precious gift, the memory of human goodness. Please keep this pin and remember that one small act of kindness can change someone's entire world." James kept the pin on his desk at home, where it served as a daily reminder of the profound impact that simple human compassion can have. He never forgot Maria, and whenever he stood guard at the palace, he remembered that behind every tourist, every face in the crowd, was a person with dreams, struggles, and stories worth honoring. The courtyard at Buckingham Palace returned to its normal routine of ceremonies and tourist visits, but something had changed. Other guards had been inspired by James's example, and small acts of kindness became more common. A smile here, a helpful direction there, a moment of patience with a struggling visitor. These small gestures created ripples of goodness that spread far beyond the palace walls. Years later, James would tell people that the day he helped Maria was the day he truly understood what it meant to serve. It wasn't the breaking of rules that mattered, but the recognition that some rules, the rules of human decency, compassion, and kindness, were more important than any protocol ever written.